Welcome, welcome, welcome to this next edition of Sustaining Hope. Why
So
Sustaining Hope? We had a lovely annual conference. Not everybody could fit, and the title of the conference was Reorienting Towards Hope. And we saw how missing, how needed, how possible it is to raise hope. But then after the conference, how can we keep it up? How can we sustain hope? So we said, Shiva, can you come and help us and sustain hope and see how we can sustain this and continue? And the topic today is a very exciting one, is not just money, not just finance, but what is our role in using and finance for good? Because sometimes we hear about governments or corporations or funds doing things with money. What's our role? I'd love to hear that. And I'll start with the first question, Shiva. What is your role? What has your role been? What's your story line to actually to get to where you're now?
thank you very much, Daniel. So having started in finance already in the early 1990s at JP Morgan, and I was actually reflecting back what my notion of finance back then was. And it was very much tainted by, of course, studying economics, finance at university, and then coming to the trading floor and getting all these training at JP Morgan, and very much then driven by finance ultimately. And I was like, early days reflecting, who should get finance? Well, the mantra was, you obviously provide capital and finance to those who can basically pay the cost of that finance. The raison d'etre of a bank is to maximize shareholder value, to be as profitable as possible. So that all meant to, how do I squeeze in profit of every dollar, euro that I can invest in? So that was the world of finance that I entered into. I have to say there was really this dichotomy, because I came obviously from an upbringing as a Baha'i. I had actually served also at the Baha'i World Center. I was even doing voluntary service, cleaning the finance department of the Baha'i World Center. So I really started my career in finance really, right at the bottom of the chain.
So it's not the Wall Street floor, it's the World Center floor, but the same basic, like it.
So what I would like to say is start with that it felt very much I had to compartmentalize. There was my professional life at a place like JP Morgan, which very much was had a paradigm of using capital to basically using money to make more money. That's basically what that was all about. What dawned on me, and it was quite interesting, because I was nevertheless fortunate that JP Morgan allowed me to even work in emerging markets. And it was only when I worked in countries that were, back then in transition in Central Asia. So we're now talking 2-3 years into my career. That's when it really dawned on me that when you are, let's say, in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and these countries have just become now independent from the Soviet Union, and what they needed was not only financing, but they needed capacity building, they needed institutional building. And here come these private sector institutions that want to, again, use money to make more money, right? It dawned on me how there was a misfit, because there really was actually a need for what we would call development finance, for really making sure that finance helps these economies. I found it actually increasingly difficult to reconcile my personal belief system with what the finance around me was sort of dictating. It took me nevertheless almost 10 years to kind of in my head find a way, because at the end of the day, of course, you are in these large institutions, you learn a lot. And I think one point I would like to leave with whoever is either in finance or considering a career in finance, there is a real benefit of course, working for financial institutions that can give you the nuts and bolts, all the technical skills. When I moved then from the private finance to the public finance, and that is now where I have been the last 23 years in the European Investment Bank. So we are the Bank of the European Union. When I had to make a shift in that, the whole purpose of an EIB and it was created back in 1958, is actually to help to rebuild Europe. If I may just say that we're twice the size almost of the World Bank. So this is a big institution. I mean, it's a big multilateral development bank, the Bank of the EU. And this was when I realized that ultimately, when we talk about finance in the service of humanity, was there, from a public sector institution perspective, it wasn't that you use money to make more money. You actually, invest in projects to improve the conditions and the lives of people. So that really made a huge shift in the purpose. And it was thankfully within that transition, I've sort of also seen over the years how the financial markets have evolved. We have seen increasingly, not only in the public sector financial world, but also in the private sector, that there are investors who don't want to just maximize their returns. It's not what's the risk and let me just price it and get the highest return for it, but they're also looking at what is the impact, what is the purpose. And this shift, what is very often referred to as impact financing, has actually developed into a beautiful partnership, if I put it this way, between the public and the private financial community funds, where you have both public money and private money that really have, therefore, an impact focus. And the impact can be can come in many different ways. You very often hear the word sustainable finance, which then is looking at maybe climate change, at social issues, at governance issues. You have gender finance, which is looking very often at is finance inclusive? I mean, that has certainly been one of the topics that has preoccupied me over the years. Does everybody have access to finance in the same degree? And what we are realizing is that actually the statistics are very much not in favor of, let's say, half the population of the world, women, who are less banked globally, so underbanked, very often not even able to open bank accounts in still many countries in the world. And beyond that, when you have women entrepreneurs, they still have a higher challenge in accessing financing. What I've observed is from 1993, where you felt that when you entered the world of finance, especially the private sector, you had to kind of leave your values behind at home and just play the game that the financial institutions were pushing you into, the maximizing shareholder value, maximizing profits. We are in a world where actually you have now very purpose-driven, conscious, I mean, there's a lot of different terminology, sustainable, responsible investors also in the private sector community, who are very much making sure that they are putting their money where their mouth is. They're very value-based oriented. Of course, one thing one has to always look out for is how much is reality and how much is marketing. So you may have heard the word of greenwashing or impact washing. Sadly, we now see the other term, which we hear in the US even, which is green hushing or impact hushing. And this is interesting because that is actually in an environment where you want to do good, you want to actually finance climate change, but you don't want to talk about it because this could actually create other problems, right?
And I love that at the ebbf we're not hashing anything, and I love this introduction to your life, your things, which goes for money to money for improvement the lives of people. And this is just a taster of what you can tap into with Shiva. And I think Marc also joined an interesting story of continents, of different organizations. I think the initial financial thing, was it Boy Scouts? Did you do anything with the Boy Scouts finance or not? Was that the starting point of your financial career?
So yeah, maybe just give you a quick background of kind of my experience with finance and kind of how I come into it, because it's really interesting to hear Shiva's background and kind of her thing. And I think together we can look at the almost the total finance system, the whole ecosystem of it, and kind of look at it from all those different angles. So so indeed, so my experience in finance is mostly from the corporate side of things. So I did not work in the banking system or in the financing system as such. It was really more as a user of that capital. And so I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for over 25 years, and then in the agriculture industry, and now I'm in the humanitarian sector. So a couple of different sectors, but always as sort of a leader of finance in those organizations. And essentially, I would kind of summarize the essence of my role has always been primarily around helping an organization to make decisions about where it allocates its resources. And so that's the theme that kind of runs through, is on what basis are we making these decisions, to invest in this or that, and when you can, that I would summarize it kind of down to that. And I really agree with the way Shiva was describing it, that I think this has really evolved certainly over these last 30 plus years in my experience. From being kind of what you're taught in sort of classic MBA school, where it's sort of, the definition of NPV and maximum shareholder value and these sorts of things. And so you're sort of making those decisions largely based on a certain set of parameters, that you're trying to optimize. And I certainly found myself kind of struggling with that over the years of sort of, is that the complete picture? Are we making the decision with all of the factors involved, or is there more to the story, kind of? And I think it's, of course, out of that as she was describing, that there's this sort of emerging field of impact investing, where some more of those sort of maybe harder to quantify factors that kind of go towards making better decisions kind of come into, and of course ultimately what I've kind of also come to kind of realize is kind of, let's say, convergence of my own values and understanding of those values, and some of these financial tools, which are actually quite useful in many respects. I think the fundamental tools themselves, I don't question. I think the main thing that I've come to realize is that we're not including enough of the variables and enough of the factors into the decision-making process, and I think the main thing is to kind of come to the realization that, what actually is the goal, right? What is the purpose that we're trying to kind of aim for? Is it to optimize, this tiny part of the whole, puzzle, or is it in fact ideal that all these things sort of line up, and that ultimately the goal is, how do we make the world a better place, right? Not just today, but sustainably over time, cumulatively over time. Like, that's actually kind of the goal. And of course, that's gigantic. I mean, again, how do you solve for that gigantic piece? So I think it's kind of over time, kind of thinking through, how do we reconcile those sort of things of the tools that we've learned, but what is actually the goal? What's the objective? And how do we bring those in there? So to me, my vision would be not to talk about impact investing as this niche corner of the finance world, but how do we get to the point where everything is impact investing, right? That the whole system is impact investing, that the whole system can have an impact. And what is that impact? The impact is to make the world better.
And the only good news with so many polycrises happening at the same time is that we are in the best position to create a whole new system. Interesting, huh? We've got an ambitious group, some that are aware of limits and some have no limits, which is quite amazing. And Shiva, you were talking about the key elements, the two elements of injustice and of a much worse world, because half of the population is given less opportunities. So this lack of diversity, lack of inclusivity. So if the theme is sustaining hope and our role in using finance, can you tell us something about some of your approaches to bring these values of justice and things to bring more uniting that people can use?
First of all, what very often happens, we underestimate actually the role we each have, because we're not only, obviously, even those who are not in finance, they are consumers. So by buying certain products, you are actually, in a way, providing leverage to those companies who sell those products. So there's, as a consumer, you have collectively a big say, because one of the key risks of deciding who we actually provide capital to is market risk. And with market risk, we mean, who are the customers? So that is one. As investors, we may be either individually picking stocks or giving it to somebody to pick for us. or our pension funds are picking stocks, but that, we all collectively are again feeding into that whole financial systems. And this is something that very often goes a bit under. We don't realize that actually a lot of our money that is sitting in savings accounts and investment accounts is actually potentially going to invest in companies that may not be aligned to our values, or they actually are and we don't even know it. So just maybe to understand that there is actually maybe a bigger role than that we play. Coming back to that other question, so what we are doing on the public side is, first of all, raise awareness. So what we did on gender finance, we actually published a report in 2020 of why women entrepreneurs are underfunded, and actually literally brought the data out and some analysis to at least raise awareness that it's not a level playing field. And we also made very much the observation that one reason you don't have potentially more women entrepreneurs finance is that you actually don't have enough women who write those checks, who are women investors, that there is a high correlation having women investors financing women-led companies, that this could be part of the solution. And then the other area was really making sure that we raise greater awareness also among women-led companies, that there are public sector schemes that are available to them, so that there's also greater awareness and more demand for those. And finally, just a broader capacity building in educational side, which very often starts already in much earlier in education, financial literacy, and so on. So, but ultimately, what happened is we needed to make sure that, and we did that through our subsidiary, which is our limited partner investor in funds, where they actually put one of the criteria to see, okay, how diverse are the teams that are coming for investments into let's say into a venture capital fund. Is that team actually, where are there women, men, is there enough diversity in what roles there are? So that became an evaluation criteria and investment criteria. And increasingly, we're also putting more emphasis on, are the companies that they are investing in, also the portfolio companies, led by women. So it's really trying to make sure that you are looking at it from a much more holistic perspective, on the funding side and on the company side, who are the decision makers. And then there is a third angle, and this is where I would definitely recommend a book that, for those of you who are interested in gender finance, by Caroline Perez, Invisible Women. There is actually a lot of data that actually money, capital, and this is to Marc River, and I would pass on the floor to Marc because he is definitely in the right position to talk about it. Sadly, very often capital is not allocated the same way to women issues. It could be women health. A lot of research has not actually been equally done on women and men. And so drugs have been over time developed that have not been tested on women and may actually be dangerous for women to take because we don't even know, the results. Women were considered to be too complicated as species to be part of clinical trials. Now, this is slowly changing. But we still have products, and we all have probably either tried to get a parking ticket out of a machine or all sorts of things where we believe that we live in a world built, I have to say, by men for men, not by humans for humans. And this is something, when we talk about capital allocation, are we putting capital also in a way that actually meets the needs of the whole population, not just of a default, which is very often the male default.
And Marc, before you dive into that, I loved your concept that you mentioned, which was about actually financial tools are useful, they're not useful. What we are not including is enough of the variables. And it's difficult, because I think that's why GDP is such a normal and it's such a wrong measure. It's easy to compare and to do. So we always go for the easier thing. So how do you create the incentives to make work more difficult? Because that's basically what you're trying to do. To make it more true, you make it more difficult and adding more variables.
No, indeed. I think this is the really, talk about how the impact that we can all make. I think one impact we can all make is be part of the conversation and ask these questions, so that this is incorporated in. And I think as a skill, if you're a finance professional, one of the things that I really kind of say a lot is, if you think about one way to think about what are the skills that we need to be great finance people, it starts with a foundation, first of all, of integrity, right? Of values, strong values. Next layer of the cake, if you will, would be the being able to understand processes and systems and making sure that there's good quality data emerging out of our systems. The next level, once we've got good data, then we can do good analysis, right? And of course, the quality of that analysis gets better and better the more that we understand what the problem is we're trying to solve for, right? And thinking about the thing we're trying to optimize, bringing all those variables in, understand the relationship and stuff like that. But then the last piece of the puzzle that's the hardest, I think, for finance professionals to be great at is influence. At the very top of the pie of the cake is that last set of muscles, which is around having the conversation, being able to speak to other people, because we can't just make decisions in isolation just within the finance world. It's only going to be implemented if we convince the other decision makers, kind of either in the organization, things like that. So I think this is kind of one framework to think about and to kind of ask ourselves, where can we get better? Which parts of those things, if we're spending all our time on process and systems, we don't have time for the other stuff, that's a problem. But then, and I think one way to kind of then build in, what's a framework for thinking about the bigger picture? I think to me, the most useful thing I found is to keep going back to purpose. What is the purpose of my organization that I'm a part of? And how does that purpose align with making the world better? Very simple. And of course, that's a never-ending, sort of question, right? You can always add more to the puzzle and things like that. But I think it's important that that's kind of the North Star that we kind of aim towards and have that discussion and debate. Is what we're doing, if we're optimizing, is it going to make the world better? In what way does it make better? Is it just today, or is it continuously over time? It's all these sort of factors that you kind of bring in. And I think that's important. And so I think there are these, I've seen many sort of practical examples of where that question comes in. So for example, let's say in the healthcare space, you mentioned the pharmaceutical world where you're making decisions about things. Indeed, it can be very difficult where you might prioritize one project which is sort of easier to justify in the short term. But then you've got, for example, orphan drugs or drugs which treat a very small population, and just financially, mathematically, you cannot justify one company going after to solve a problem because it costs so much more than you can ever recover in revenue. So now, as a society, how do we solve this problem? And I think this is a good example of, if we think as a system overall more comprehensively, what is the goal? The goal is to improve the quality of health of an entire population. And there's so many elements to the puzzle. Maybe the organization that you're immediately part of is one part of the puzzle, but how does it connect to the rest of the system? So that may be the other capability that we have to all become better at, is systems thinking and see, so the purpose. Where does this fit into the greater system? What's my part of it? How do I influence the whole system to kind of, go more and more towards that North Star and in that direction?
We saw in COVID, everybody coming together and finding the solution very quickly. So we saw that if there's willingness, there's ways to actually go forward. And maybe in terms of finding, because it's not financially viable to go for this small drug for this small population, there's a lot of reputation. So if you create a strong narrative, we don't go for the profits, we go for the caring, and you create a really strong narrative that has a financial element as well. So how we learn to use narrative to create reputation that elevates the financial, even though the bottom line doesn't say so, that could be a way forward. And because we're sustaining hope, my dear Shiva, I would like to hear something that brought you joy in your financial actions, because I'm a very strong believer that joy will actually bring forward. So money is always seen as something cold, as thing, but actually can bring joy.
Actually, it ties in exactly. My example is actually on infectious diseases, and we're talking now before COVID, even 2012, 11, 12, when we as a public sector bank were trying to tackle actually exactly the challenge that Marc is referring from a pharmaceutical perspective, because developing a vaccine for TB, malaria, where the markets are in poor countries and you're not going to get the highest financial return, but you have still a lot of R&D costs, a lot of investments needed. Somehow the risk returns didn't align, for the pharmaceuticals to really push into it. And what we then did together with the European Commission, and we were working closely with the Gates Foundations and others, to see how could we actually create mechanisms of risk sharing to actually tackle this. Because, there is, and again, if you use financial sort of a criteria of risk return, there is what we would call an asymmetry. The private investor, the company, like a pharmaceutical company, puts has a lot of risk, but the returns are not only financial, but also societal. Now, in order to justify, but the risks are sitting with this company mainly, right? So there's this kind of a misalignment. And in order to kind of create a level playing field on that, you actually have a business case for public sector support. And this is what we developed through this mechanism called the Infectious Diseases Financing Facility, where we basically were able to give like repayable grants or forgivable loans, basically money that was much more forgiving to vaccine developers. We did that because we on the EIB side had on our side the commission, who usually would just give grants, but grants, once they're out, you never see that money again. With this facility, there is, in a success case, the money comes back, it goes to the next one. So there's hope, right? I mean, also about the bill, you kind of, create a bit more make more investments with the same amount of ultimately starting point. And so what gave me a lot of satisfaction was that back when we developed that instrument, 2015, ultimately, it was still a niche area. But guess what? In February 2020, when there were a bunch of vaccine developers, such as BioNTech and others, who were looking for major investments into their vaccines, we, the EIB, together with the European Commission, had a financial instruments mechanism ready in place. And with that, we're able to put 100 million into BioNTech to strengthen their hand in the negotiations with Pfizer so that those vaccines would actually get to market faster, right? So in a way, for me, what brought me a lot of joy and hope is that there was a level of, we did that back then for the reasons I explained, but also to be prepared, right? You need to, finance should also kind of create more preparedness, like we are doing that. The problem is there is no vaccine for climate change, right? I mean, there is a vaccine for some diseases, but not for climate change. But we need to prepare, we need to adapt, we need to, and that's where finance can actually go towards very important purposes, like even right now, adapting to the new reality of high temperatures. So that's the adaptation side, or mitigation, reducing the CO2 emissions. But this is where a lot of finance is needed. And so long story short, that was what gave me a lot of hope for finance, that we actually managed to create these mechanisms. And there are many other examples of such mechanisms that are out there.
Same question is, how can you drive people forward to understand more from numbers? A different layer is an element of, I wouldn't say joy, but something that said, hey, these numbers really mean something. Have there been some exercises where you change the mindset from this is a bottom line to actually this number means something different?
I think there are a number of examples where it's been really fun to kind of see the conversation suddenly expand to something much more than just the specific, classic set of numbers and things. I think I'll give you a couple of examples. I think one kind of moment that that I was pretty amazed by was one example was in the pharma world where one of the big medical questions that's been unanswered for a long time has been like Alzheimer's, for example, as kind of a disease, and it's one of these ones where companies spent like billions really for each one only to fail, and the chance of success was very, very small. And so probably the one where I was the happiest was one where we ended up failing. Actually, was where, in spite of knowing that that was the likely outcome, we still went forward with making the bet. And part of the rationale for making the bet was actually a feeling of responsibility that we have. In other words, we as this company were a certain scale that, and we're benefiting from these other areas where they are successful. Who else is going to place the bet? For this thing, we have a duty to think of the whole portfolio, the whole system, and say, look, we need to reinvest part of these proceeds into placing these huge bets that are most likely going to fail. If the company was only based on this, you would never make the bet, right? Because it would be just too risky. The whole thing would fail. So that's kind of an example, I think, of where the conversation was kind of bigger than just the immediate project. You were able to kind of put it in perspective. I think there are, of course, in the humanitarian space, this is kind of comes around again and again. And one of the most difficult questions that we have now in the humanitarian space is, how do you think about the impact? How do you decide what you do? Because it's so much harder to measure, the outcomes. So even there, I would say the joy has been in just that the conversation's happening, and that there's kind of, I think, more and more openness to kind of broaden the discussion, either to, before it might have been just ignore it, it's just too complicated, versus now I think there's a lot more openness and stuff, and to see more and more a recognition that, these things are all connected, and it's really a whole system that we're trying to kind of influence, and how do these pieces kind of fit together.
You two, Shiva and Marc, are parents, and I wonder the role of money and finance between your generation and your children. Has it changed? Do you see other perceptions? So difference in generations in terms of what money is for, how it should be spent?
Studies have shown, and increasingly done like by UBS and so on, that the generational wealth transfer that's been happening, or that is happening right now, from the baby boomers to the next generation, there is actually much greater emphasis. And that's why a lot of these banks all of a sudden had a whole avalanche of new products in the sustainability space, in the ESG space, because the next generation was looking for much greater alignment than their forefather, their parents' generation. And I don't think we should take it for granted. I think this is actually something that is very fragile, because I'm also very concerned with what is happening around us in the world. And we shouldn't just think that the next generation, they have seen the light, and that, money is going exactly into these spaces, because I think there are very strong also forces right now that are unfortunately pushing money also into the, I'm thinking on the climate change front, to again, investments that are unfortunately keeping the dependence on fossil fuels and so on. So let's not take anything for granted. I think as parents, the more we can expose our children and allow them to understand actually the role of finance, the role of money, how they actually, as consumers, as investors, actually giving them a sense of also, that they can invest their pocket money in companies, and give them that understanding that actually, Marc was explaining as a capital allocator, we each are allocating we are each capital allocators. So if we put our money where our mouth is, where our values are, I think we will collectively make a huge difference. So the more we actually bring that into our into the conversation. And I think very often in many families, money is a bit of a taboo. We don't talk about it enough, right? With our own children, or if we talk about it, it's not maybe in that sense. We talk about not spending it, but maybe we don't give enough of an effort how to spend the money.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Marc.
I think so. I've got 3 sons who are now sort of young adults and sort of that age. And certainly one thing I can see in this new generation that's exciting is, there's really a huge, kind of unhappiness at the level of injustices that they see. And I think that's positive, that they recognize these injustices and are not happy that this continue and want to somehow change it. Now, at the same time, my urging is kind of not to throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. In other words, yes, there's a lot we have to change with our system. We have to reinvent, but not to just to discard absolutely everything, right? In other words, there are these fundamental concepts that I think are actually valid. I wouldn't, again, the tools, the concept of productivity is a good concept, but the question is, what are we including in the definition of productivity? The formula is simply the change in output divided by the change in input, and and that it makes sense for that to improve over time. But what do we mean by output? What are the things we include there, and what are the inputs? That's the conversation. Not to discard the idea of productivity, right? It's being more efficient, being better, improving quality. That is a good thing, and we want to see that. But what do we mean by quality?
What do we measure? Jelle, you have an excellent question. Do you want to open the mic and share it?
I'm always just fascinated to see some of the best practices that you've seen in different sectors, in different countries, and in different parts of the world. Any inspiring best practices that you've seen on a practical level, capacities or skill sets that teams or individuals or organizations as a whole are kind of raising the status quo, so the level of the culture reflects generosity and service to humanity.
And I love what you highlight, Jelle. Improve the level of generosity.
I think where I've seen that kind of work the best, it's whenever that the organization that I've been in, kind of really goes towards the feeling of empathy and kind of connects to that kind of, because that is really in the end what is most inspiring for people, and again, it comes back to kind of articulating in the very purpose of the organization and finding a way to connect that to something that is really meaningful and inspiring and things like that. So in the healthcare space, it was very often about just remembering the patient. That's who we're doing all this for. And would we be proud of what we're doing, in the sense of that kind of thing? Or in the humanitarian space, it's of course much easier, right, to articulate purpose and mission, and indeed it's what inspires these people in this sector to risk their own lives, to do this work, right? So I think being able to link back to that kind of purpose and mission, I think, is a good example of being able to kind of raise the vision of what it is this is all about. On a practical level, in one of the pharma companies, they had the practice as well of remembering our responsibility as part of a community, and they would do that by having 1 week a year, a so-called Give Back Week, to encourage all the employees and to enable them to do service in the community for a week. Take whatever time you need that week to kind of do that. Again, it's kind of symbolic. It's not that that's going to shift everything, but it kind of served as a kind of a reminder of that. And I found that to be quite inspiring, on a practical level, and it just kind of reminded us of these higher values that were really what it's all about.
And Shiva, from your point of view, generosity, how do we unlock it?
I actually witnessed it firsthand when I was heading the EIB Institute. That was the part of the EIB that also had the humanitarian donation part. And to I think that Jale, and I love her, the way she's putting the question. What sometimes many times, the requests for donation would not come from the top, but they would come from staff who would put it on our intranet, who would persistently approach us saying, why aren't we doing something? People are dying, there's this huge flood somewhere very far from here. But, and that, so that bottom up pressure actually led to often, making, prompting us to do these donations. The other thing is also creating then opportunities for staff to then do their own donation, like by providing them, the opportunities. I mean, we had in the past matching schemes, but there are a lot of ways where you can kind of give people not only the opportunity to donate themselves, but then have more like multiply effect, because the organization then, doubles, triples it or whatever. So there are a lot of good practices, but I think what, for me, what has actually, to that question, the role of the individual, we should not underestimate in organizations, and if we are very strong believers and there's a cause that, we should find a few allies and really be a broken record and make our voices heard, because that in itself will raise, the stakes, so to speak. And I've seen really how donations have actually happened because of that.
And it's working. Marc and Shiva, this was all about sustaining hope and getting people into action. Anis is asking for tips.
My question is more related about at the leadership level or at an organization or an executive level at an organization. I've noticed in my experience that the higher you go, sometimes you see like less and less consultative process going on when decision making happens, and it's a single or singular person carrying the weight of a decision that can impact the organization in an important way. And at least where I work, I've been noticing that some of the leadership take on more of a consultative process, and I see better results, and others don't. And I can't really like pinpoint why that happens. I wanted to see, like, we know that sometimes when you consult, you get better outcomes, but that doesn't usually happen at those levels. So just wondering, from your perspective, with all the experience you have at that level, how have you seen consultation take place or not? And maybe how have you been able to influence those around you to take on this practice, right? To consult, to reach decision making, and not just as a traditional way of like a single person accountable for a major decision, right, of the organization.
Yeah, I love the question. Thank you so much, Anis. I think it's really, I think it's the key, because again, it's about the conversation, right? So one thing that could give you hope, I think, in all that is, the good news is, in all those forums, even in senior leader forums, these are composed of human beings. And as we know, all human beings, are composed of all these elements. And in fact, I think these kind of timeless values and principles, in fact, do resonate with everyone. And I think the key in all those spaces, it's just like with any group of human beings who are having a conversation. What is the level of trust and safety in that space to enable a real, true discussion that is aiming towards whatever that common objective is, And I was saying before, hopefully that objective is something that's aligned with something positive that's making the world somehow better. And I found that as a practical tip as well that helps always when you're in a group of people. What is this common thing we're trying to aim for, so that it's not adversarial in a one-on-one kind of thing, but it's that we're collectively trying to achieve this thing, whatever that is. I find that kind of helps to shift the dynamics a bit. And of course, there's the conversation in the room at the moment, around the consultation itself. But then there's all of the preparation beforehand as well. The relationship building, the experience together, again, that trust building. those are the more that's in place, the better, right? And it's something that you never achieve. I think it's sort of continuous, right? We always get better and better and better at having conversations, at improving relationships and things like that. So where, again, to have, it's not that we don't have conflict, but how do you have the conflict be constructive and not destructive? And that you're sort of drawing out, the kind of the lessons, and sort of that we're kind of getting to the best possible decision for the moment, knowing that if we maintain that unity and that relationship, et cetera, that we'll be able to improve it later when the faults of that maybe reveal themselves.
Shiva, do you want to answer this question, or because it's an
Yes.
intergenerational call, so we've got a student who's about to finish their studies, if that helps at all? You decide.
Yes, I'll just say one sentence to Anis. From a purely, even if you deal with very financially minded, so not these enlightened people that Marc is talking about, but maybe very hardcore, people who are thinking only of in financial terms or risk return perspectives, consultation actually spreads your risk. It's a hedging mechanism, because you don't want to be later, be the only one who. So there is a lot of risk by having taking decisions without any consultation. So maybe there may be many motivations why people consult, but that could be one way to maybe make people feel more in tune to consult and reduce their risk of reduce their personal risk and reduce the risk of the organization's decisions. Mm-hmm. I love the questions of Ryan, and I was actually thinking, how do you indeed identify those firms? Now, these days, there is such a great way of getting to information. So you're talking about quantitative finance. So I assume you are looking at the buy side or investors who are investing. Basically like maybe private equity or large institutional investors who are investing in companies, and you want to see. So if I understood your question correctly, the point, regardless of what type of investor, I think a lot of it actually comes down to looking at their track record, what have they invested in, right? And seeing whether you can actually see that they have put human-centric values. I'm just giving you an example. For instance, they have invested in video gaming, and I know my dear cousin Jamalia, he's on the call. He was explaining to us yesterday that a lot of those video game companies are actually, sadly, using those platforms not always for the health, mental health, and other health of our children. So, let's say that investor has invested despite of the news coming out that these firms have these problems, or platforms that have these problems. That to me is a misalignment. This is where, if you say one thing and you're actually doing another thing, and this is where I would look for, on the one hand, convergence, and on the other hand, basically this divergence or misalignment. And then, of course, through speaking to people who work in these organizations and really understand how investment decisions are made, what are the criteria. I think these are very legitimate questions when you interview. Actually, we're always told that the Gen Z, so your generation, ask those tough questions. They don't take anymore the sort of thing that our generation maybe took, like, they really want to know, the values behind organizations and so on. So yes, ask those questions. It's very much, it shows that you, that these things are important. And if you see that those companies are actually, in a way, ignoring or seeing this as not relevant questions, well, then you have your answer also probably, that those are maybe not companies that will in the long run be a good place for you to thrive. But that's just my first initial reaction. I don't know, Marc, whether you'd like to add anything, or Anis, whether you would like to say anything. Or no, sorry, Ryan.
And to that answer, Shiva, I think it's wonderful. My advice would just be really look at the purpose of whatever organization it is and make sure that you are aligned with that because the skills that you're learning are extremely valuable and very useful skills. It's important to be able to quantify things and to be able to measure, and all that those are important factors into decision making. Again, but then how do you bring in all the other factors that are maybe less measurable, into the puzzle? But yeah, go for it. It's great that you're learning this area. Wonderful. Good luck to you, Ryan.
Marc and Shiva, you have been amazing. Thank you so much for answering such a diversity of questions. We posted the links to the next annual event in Spanish, which will be in Santiago de Chile, right next to the temple. So if you know any Spanish-speaking people, you've done a fantastic job of sustaining hope. We thank you very much for bringing to life finance, money, and what it's really for and what it will be for. Thank you so much to everybody. See you on the 8th of July or later on.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
So much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.